Welcome to Echo of Crime YouTube channel. In the heart of Maple Hill, Missouri, faith was more than a belief. It was a lifestyle. Sunday mornings meant crowded pews, polished shoes, and the scent of coffee drifting through the church hall. The heart of it all was Pastor Randy Chalmers, a man whose voice carried both warmth and authority. He'd been there for over a decade, marrying couples, visiting the sick, blessing newborns, and guiding troubled souls. People didn't just respect him, they trusted him. He wasn't the kind of pastor who chased attention. Randy dressed plainly, drove an old sedan, and always spoke softly about humility. He'd tell his congregation, "Our wealth isn't in our wallets, it's in our hearts." And they believed him. He knew everyone's name, every story, every struggle. The community adored him because he never asked for much, just faith, unity, and a few more donations to help keep the lights on. Under his leadership, the small church grew. Donations increased. Programs expanded. The youth ministry got new computers, the choir received new robes, and plans were announced for a larger fellowship center. Each Sunday, Randy thanked the congregation for their generosity. "We are doing the Lord's work," he'd say with a smile. No one ever thought to question where all that money was really going. Behind the sermons. But even saints have shadows. Unbeknownst to his followers, Randy was hiding a secret that would one day destroy everything he'd built. Behind the pulpit, behind the gentle sermons and community projects, he'd grown obsessed, not with greed in the usual sense, but with control. He had quietly set up several secondary accounts, checking and savings portfolios that looked legitimate on paper, but weren't part of the church's registered finances. Only his signature appeared on them. Each week, as the collection plates overflowed with cash and checks, he'd make small transfers. Just a few $100s here, maybe $1,000 there, amounts small enough to avoid suspicion. Over the years, it added up to hundreds of thousands. It started, he told himself, as borrowing, a temporary loan. He convinced himself he'd pay it back when donations were higher. But soon, the withdrawals became a habit. The funds financed vacations, fine dinners, and expensive gifts. Luxuries he justified as God's blessings. The church board, made up of volunteers who saw him as a spiritual father, rarely asked questions. The treasurer was a retired teacher who trusted Randy completely. Monthly meetings were casual, more about prayer than paperwork. If a balance seemed short, Randy had a simple explanation ready. A check cleared late. Nobody doubted him. Why would they? He was their pastor. To the outside world, Randy looked like the picture of modesty. He spoke at charity drives, handed out free food on weekends, and personally visited every family that lost a loved one. When the local newspaper ran an article titled, "The Pastor Bringing Hope to Maple Hill," he framed it and hung it in his office. But that same office held secrets no one knew about. Tucked inside a locked drawer were credit card statements, cash envelopes, and travel receipts, all paid with church funds. Late at night, when everyone else had gone home, he'd stay behind in the dimly lit office, updating spreadsheets and quietly moving money between accounts. The glow of the computer screen reflected off his glasses. As he whispered prayers he didn't believe anymore. Randy wasn't a man stealing out of desperation. He wasn't broke. He wasn't starving. What he craved was admiration, the feeling of being indispensable, the one man holding everything together. Each time he diverted another deposit, he told himself it was for the greater good. "I've earned it," he'd think. "I've sacrificed more than anyone." He began believing that God was on his side, that maybe divine favor excused his actions. It's how most betrayals begin, not with malice, but with quiet justification. Whispers in the hall. It took years for suspicion to grow. The first sign came when a church board member, Eleanor Peters, noticed a missing donation record. It was a small thing, a $500 check meant for a mission trip that never showed up in the official statement. When she asked about it, Randy smiled and said, "Oh, that was just a processing delay." Eleanor believed him. Everyone did. But small inconsistencies kept appearing. Vendors claimed they hadn't been paid on time. Receipts went missing. Budget updates were delayed. At first, it looked like simple clerical mistakes. But deep down, Eleanor began to feel uneasy. Something about Randy's answers felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced them. Still, no one wanted to accuse the pastor of wrongdoing. He was too loved, too respected. The idea seemed unthinkable. Doubt felt like sin. The truth stayed hidden for years, buried beneath sermons, smiles, and Sunday blessings. By 2018, the church's financial troubles had quietly worsened. Bills were late. The building expansion fund was empty, even though donations had been steady. Randy blamed rising costs, promising that God would provide. The congregation believed him again. But God, as it turned out, had already provided someone, a new treasurer. Her name was Lydia Moore, a former accountant who had recently joined the church. Organized, sharp-eyed, and gentle in nature, she volunteered to help modernize the bookkeeping. Randy agreed, not realizing that this decision would unravel everything. Lydia noticed the same thing Eleanor once did, discrepancies that didn't make sense. But unlike Eleanor, she didn't stop asking. She began cross-checking transactions, verifying accounts, and digging through old ledgers. The deeper she went, the stranger it became. There were account numbers she didn't recognize, transfers that didn't match donation patterns, withdrawals made on dates when Randy was supposedly on church business trips. And one evening, as the church emptied after Bible study, Lydia stayed late. She turned off the office lights, pulled up the bank statements again, and stared at the evidence piling up. Then she saw it, an account under the church's name, but only one signature on file. Sunday mornings in Maple Hill always began the same way. Warm coffee in the fellowship hall, the choir rehearsing softly, and Pastor Randy greeting families at the door with his gentle smile. But this Sunday felt different. There was tension in the air, a stillness Lydia Moore couldn't ignore. She had spent the last week combing through bank statements that didn't add up, and the more she uncovered, the more her stomach turned. Every number told a story. Checks labeled charity outreach that never left the account. Transfers to personal savings disguised as building maintenance. Hundreds of small withdrawals, each too minor to notice alone, but together forming a pattern that spelled betrayal. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even the church board. She needed proof, not suspicion. So, when Randy walked past her that morning, greeting her with his usual, "Good morning, Sister Lydia," she forced a polite smile and nodded back. But behind her calm expression, she was memorizing every detail, his tone, his eyes, the way he adjusted his tie. She was looking at a man of faith and quietly realizing he might be a thief. That week, Lydia stayed late after work, often alone in the church office. She opened the old metal filing cabinets, flipping through dusty ledgers that hadn't been touched in years. Every file revealed more red flags, fake invoices, double-logged donations, missing receipts. One entry, stop or cold, a $10,000 equipment purchase listed under youth program. But the youth group had never received any new equipment. She printed the statements, organized them in folders, and locked them in her desk. Her next move was to contact Eleanor Peters, the senior board member who had once questioned Randy years earlier. When Lydia showed her the records, Eleanor's face went pale. Together, they spent an entire evening retracing the money trail. What they found was staggering, nearly $300,000 missing across 5 years. The two women decided to call an emergency board meeting. No gossip, no whispers, just facts. The plan was simple: confront Randy privately before involving the authorities. They didn't want to destroy a man's life without certainty, but deep down, both of them knew the truth was already written in the numbers. It happened on a Tuesday evening in the small conference room behind the sanctuary. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly. 5 board members sat around a folding table, the documents spread out before them. When Pastor Randy entered, smiling as always, he immediately sensed the shift in the air. "Randy," Eleanor began softly, "we found some inconsistencies in the accounts. Can you explain these?" He looked at the papers, line after line of transactions, his handwriting, his signatures. For the first time in years, his calm demeanor cracked. His jaw tightened. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly. These were operational transfers, internal adjustments. But the more he talked, the deeper he sank. Lydia gently pushed forward one more file, the unregistered bank account under the church's name, bearing only his signature. Silence filled the room. When he realized the evidence was irrefutable, Randy stopped talking. He stared at the table for a long moment, then whispered, "I only took what I deserved. I kept this church alive." No one spoke. The man they had followed for years, the one who had baptized their children and preached about honesty, was admitting that he'd stolen from the same people who trusted him most. After the meeting, Eleanor and Lydia sat in the parking lot, the cold night pressing against the car windows. They didn't want to call the police. They wanted to believe this could be fixed quietly, maybe through confession and repayment. But by the next morning, the state audit team was already on its way. Once the bank was notified, it was out of their hands. News traveled fast in a small town. By Thursday, half the congregation had heard whispers of financial issues. By Friday, reporters were calling. On Saturday, Pastor Randy was taken in for questioning. There were no handcuffs, no spectacle, just quiet resignation. When officers asked him why he did it, he said the same thing he told the board. "I built this church. I just borrowed what was mine." The following Sunday, the pulpit stood empty for the first time in 15 years. The congregation sat in silence, tears, confusion. Some refused to believe it. Others demanded answers. The assistant pastor read a brief statement. "The church has discovered serious financial misconduct. We are cooperating fully with authorities. Please keep your hearts open and your faith strong." For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the old wooden pews. Then someone began to pray. One by one, others joined in. It wasn't a loud or defiant prayer, just quiet words searching for understanding. The betrayal cut deeper than money. It shook their sense of safety, their belief that goodness always looks like goodness. The man who had preached against greed had lived inside it. The man who'd asked them to give had taken it all away. The sound of rain echoed softly on the roof of the county courthouse. It was the same kind of rain that used to fall on the church roof in Maple Hill. Steady, cleansing, almost symbolic. Inside, Pastor Randy Chalmers sat at the defendant's table, wearing the same quiet expression that had once made people trust him. Only this time, there was no pulpit, no choir behind him, no congregation waiting to be inspired. He looked tired, not the exhaustion that comes from work, but the kind that comes from being caught in your own reflection. Across from him sat the prosecutor, calm and collected. There was no anger in the courtroom, only quiet disbelief. For years, Randy had preached about sin and redemption. Now, it was his turn to face both. The confession came in parts, like a broken sermon. During questioning, Randy admitted that he had opened secondary accounts to help manage funds, but when the evidence mounted, he stopped defending himself. He sighed, rubbed his temples, and said softly, "I didn't start out trying to steal. I just took what I thought I deserved." He spoke about late nights when the church bills piled up, the loneliness of leadership, the pressure to keep appearances. "They thought we were growing, but I was just keeping us afloat," he said. But auditors proved otherwise. The funds hadn't gone to repairs or maintenance. They had gone to his personal expenses, travel, dining, and private purchases. When asked why he never stopped, he looked down and whispered, "Because no one ever questioned me." Those words hit harder than any verdict ever could. They summed up the entire tragedy. A man trusted completely, never challenged, and eventually consumed by his own unchecked power. The courtroom was full on sentencing day. Reporters filled the back row. Church members, many of whom had once called him a spiritual father, sat silently with folded hands. Lydia and Eleanor were there too, sitting side by side, holding the evidence folder that had exposed the truth. When the judge entered, the room went still. Randy stood, his head bowed. The judge spoke with a tone that was not angry, but weary, like someone addressing a disappointment rather than a criminal. "You were given trust, Pastor Chalmers, a kind of trust few ever receive. And you used it for yourself." He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement, along with restitution to the church. No one clapped. No one cheered. In Maple Hill, justice didn't feel like victory. It felt like mourning. Randy didn't react when the gavel fell. He simply closed his eyes. Some said he prayed. Others thought he just couldn't look up anymore. For the people of Maple Hill, the weeks that followed were the hardest in the church's history. The building felt hollow. Attendance dropped. The offering plates stayed light. Some members transferred to other churches, too heartbroken to stay. But a small group refused to give up. Lydia, now the interim treasurer, organized community meetings to rebuild transparency. They published every financial record online. Every penny was accounted for. They wanted to prove that faith could survive the failure of a man. One Sunday morning, a new pastor took the pulpit for the first time. He didn't try to replace Randy. Instead, he said, "The walls are the same. The building is the same. But we are not. We've learned that trust must be earned, and that forgiveness, when real, can rebuild what was broken." People wept quietly. For the first time in months, the church felt like a place of healing again. In prison, Randy kept mostly to himself. He worked in the chapel library, read scripture, and wrote letters that he never mailed. Some said he found peace. Others doubted it. When asked by a journalist years later if he regretted what he did, his reply was short. "I regret believing I was untouchable." It was a kind of answer that could only come from someone who finally saw the truth too late. He served 4 years before being released on parole. He didn't return to Maple Hill. No one really knows where he went after that. The man who once preached to hundreds vanished quietly into the background of his own story. Years later, the story of Maple Hill's pastor who robbed his own church became a teaching case in ethics courses and church financial seminars. It wasn't told as a scandal. It was told as a warning. It reminded people that faith without accountability can become blindness, and that even the kindest faces can hide human weakness. Lydia still works at the church. Every Sunday, she locks the donation box herself and logs every contribution before leaving. Trust, she says, can be rebuilt, but only if truth is never hidden again. As for the congregation, they learned to separate faith from personality. They realized that their belief was never meant to be in one man. It was meant to be in the truth he was supposed to represent.